So I'd like to welcome you here tonight for the second event in our academic speaker series. My name is Lynn Shea, and I'm a professor in the Liberal Studies department here at Landmark. Tonight we have Adrian Basora as our special guest. The mission of the academic speaker series is to promote an intellectual environment at the college and to facilitate important discussions for our community. And we're certainly going to have an important discussion tonight, I think. We will have a Q&A period after Ambassador Basora speaks, so I would invite you to stay for that and to please hold your questions until that time, okay? To introduce our speaker, I want to have you welcome Dan Miller, who is the chair of Liberal Studies at Landmark.
Like the easiest way to get applause, right? Just no preparation or anything. Tonight's speaker, as Lynn just mentioned, is Adrian A. Basora, who boasts an impressive academic and professional pedigree. He holds a master's degree in public affairs and international affairs from Princeton University, and undergraduate degrees from Fordham and, the Institut d'études politiques in Paris. He's fluent in French, and I clearly am not, and just demonstrated that for everybody. He has had a significant career in public service, perhaps most notably among a long list of roles. He served as National Security Director for European and Soviet Affairs from 1989 to 1991, and as U.S. Ambassador to the Czech Republic from 1992 to 1995. In the latter role, he worked with Czech and Slovak leaders to assure a successful transition during the periods preceding and following the separation of Czechoslovakia into Slovakia and the Czech Republic. He previously directed the Foreign Policy Research Institute's project on democratic transition and has worked for decades to aid in European democratic and market development. He is currently a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, a trustee in the Foreign Policy Research Institute, and co-chair of its Eurasia Program. He'll be talking tonight on an issue that is both sobering and timely: democracy's regression in the 21st century, and considering the vital question, which I think is the subtitle of the talk, can this global challenge be reversed? Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Adrian Basora.
Thank you, Professor Miller, or Chair Miller. So, thanks all for coming out tonight. I was going to say coming out in support of Landmark College, but you are Landmark College, and the supporters are elsewhere off campus, as I understand, or at least most of them. So, our topic this evening is democratic regression, the regression that we've seen in recent years around the world, both overseas and in the United States. It's a big topic, and I'd like to make this not just, as you already heard, not just a one-way lecture, but a real discussion. So I want to leave time for the Q&A and your comments, not just questions. Therefore, I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground in just 40 minutes or less, in order to leave plenty of time for questions and discussion. And here are some of the issues that I want to, that I will address with you in broad brushstrokes from an historic perspective. First, how severe is the recent regression? And how does it fit with earlier progress towards democracy in the world? What underlies this regression? And what are the chances of reversing it? And what role can the United States and other established democracies play in restoring positive economic, democratic momentum and economic momentum, by the way, in the world? My own interest in the state of democracy in the world dates from the 1960s. There are very few of you in the room who will remember the 1960s, when I began my 33-year career in the American Foreign Service. It included, my work there included postings in Latin America under John F. Kennedy's Alliance for Progress, which was a democratization policy, and then in elsewhere in Latin America, in post-Franco Spain, in France, and in Eastern Europe. And this was interspersed with policy assignments in Washington. But my most intense experience or immersion in the issues of democracy versus authoritarianism began when I was at the White House, as mentioned at the National Security Council as Director for Soviet and European Affairs. I had been at the NSC for just 6 months in November of 1989, when the Berlin Wall fell and European communism suddenly began to unravel, suddenly and unexpectedly began to unravel. The White House, State Department, Defense Department, Treasury, and many other agencies suddenly had to jettison our long-standing policy of containment of communism and create a whole new approach within a matter of just months. These new policies and programs centered on strong support for Eastern Europe's incipient democratic transitions. And by extraordinary good fortune, I had the honor of serving as U.S. ambassador in Prague. It was initially Czechoslovakia, by the way, when I got there, and then it split after I got there. This plunged me even more deeply into the issues surrounding democracy and autocracy. Our mission was to partner with the Czech, my mission and that of 150 or so members of my embassy staff. Our mission was to partner with the Czech and Slovak governments to help them create, virtually from scratch, an open market economy, an open society more broadly, and a viable democracy. So after having been part of the team that designed our policies of support for these transitions, I had the challenge of trying to implement them on the ground and to see what actually worked in practice and what did not work. The drive towards democratic reform in the former communist countries of Eastern Europe proved amazingly successful in the 1990s and up into the early 2000s. Starting right after 1989, Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, and others quickly held free elections, opened up their societies, and began to create viable free market economies, which, by the way, are a corollary of viable democracy, in my opinion. And then just 2 years later, with the breakup of the Soviet Union, these early transitions began extending into some of the former Soviet republics themselves, most notably in Ukraine, in the Caucasus region, and in the Baltic, the 3 Baltic republics. Amazing as it now seems, as of the mid-1990s, it even looked as if Russia was moving towards democracy. The less youthful of those who are not students here may remember that period personally. As some of you, only those who I just mentioned maybe, may recall, that was when Francis Fukuyama wrote a famous book at the time announcing the end of history, in which he predicted that the trend towards liberal democracy in the world had become unstoppable. So what happened to make this prediction seem so grotesquely optimistic only 3 decades later? What should we make of this current authoritarian resurgence? And what are the chances of reversing this regression, the regression that we've seen in the last few years? Based on the project on democratic transitions that Professor Miller mentioned at the Foreign Policy FPRI in Philadelphia, I'm going to share some of the insights that history seems to provide on these questions. So after a quick look at the current state of democracy in the world, I will center my presentation on the historic context of the recent regression, which I think is better understood as the latest chapter in the centuries-old struggle between democracy and authoritarianism. Now let me test my technical capabilities here. If this is supposed to give me the first slide and it's not working. So I hit the space bar. Okay. Oh, it didn't work. Will this work? Okay. So in the first slide that you also have in your printouts, in case the colors aren't as vivid here, you can see it more vividly on your printouts. This shows the present balance of democracy versus authoritarianism around the globe. And its source is Freedom House, a well-respected non-governmental organization that has tracked the state of democracy in the world for many decades. Shown in green are the free countries, or in other words, full-fledged democracies. The autocracies, the purple countries, are the autocracies, and the many countries that lie somewhere in between these two poles are highlighted in yellow or orange, depending on how it looks to you on the screen versus the printout. These latter partly free governments are often referred to as hybrid or regimes or competitive authoritarian regimes. Before we go any further, let's spend a moment on terminology. Both in my own research and in public discussions that I've participated in, I found that people all too often talk past each other for lack of a clear, common definition of democracy. And one of the worst terms in that regard is illiberal democracy, which I would put aside, and we can talk in the Q&A reasons why if you like. Freedom House provides some definitions that I find very helpful, and they are summarized in the next slide. Now let's see if this will work now. Yes, it did. No. Okay, okay, and you can also flip to your handouts if it's easier. And I'm not going to just read them to you, but I'm going to slightly comment on them. So, to qualify as a democracy, in my opinion, not just quoting Freedom House, requires regular, periodic, truly competitive elections with political office realistically open to most citizens. And for those elections to be meaningful, there must be freedom of association, freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, and very important, an independent press and free social media. At the other end of the political spectrum are the fully authoritarian regimes, where elections are heavily predetermined, even if the balloting process on election day might look superficially fair. Political office is not realistically open to any credible regime opponents. There are severe restrictions on freedom of speech and on independent press and media. And freedom of association and assembly are strongly discouraged and often violently repressed. We've seen that recently in Belarus, for example, and even in Russia, the most recent Russian elections. In between these two groupings, there's also a wide range of countries hovering between autocracy and democracy, a very important grouping. The orange or yellow ones on the map that you have in front of you. These countries hover between autocracy and democracy. I call them hybrid regimes or competitive authoritarian regimes. They do hold elections, and they permit some limited freedoms so as to maintain a facade of legitimacy in the eyes of their populations. But in practice, political competition is stacked very heavily in favor of the current ruling group. Yet many of the most critical battle lines between dictatorship and democracy are currently to be found in these hybrid countries. This is because the limited freedoms that do exist can sometimes lead either to splits within the ruling or governing elites, and or to strong public pressures or even outright revolts for reform. Ukraine and its Orange Revolution of 2004 is a prime example of a country that has been going since then precisely this kind of struggle. And it could well prove a major bellwether for the future. Now let's take a look at the past 5 decades, which I call the middle term, not the long term, so as to see how this evolving competition between authoritarianism and democracy appears from a middle term perspective. Let me now turn to the next slide, if successful. Oh, upside down. There we go. All right. So as you can see, there are currently 82, oops. Oh, well, here we are. 82 democracies in the world, which represents 42% of the 195 countries surveyed by Freedom House. This is down slightly from 87 countries and 45% in the 2004-2006 period, which was the peak of the most recent wave of democratization. So this period is where it flattened out. So from this perspective, the trend of the past 15 years is clearly worrisome. However, if we take a longer 5-decade perspective, the trend looks significantly more positive. In 1972, there were only 44 free countries in the world. And so the current total of 82 free countries represents a near doubling in the number of established democracies. You can say, therefore, that despite recent setbacks, democracy has made very substantial progress in the world over the last 50 years. And I stress this positive note because of the extreme pessimism and even defeatism that has taken hold in some circles in recent years. But now let's look a bit more closely at these medium-term trends. So the first trend line worth highlighting is the very rapid pace of increase in democracies from 1972 forward. So that's this trend line, the red. And the bumpy green line right here shows in this period an even greater acceleration in the democratization trend, and that I ascribe largely to the demise of the Soviet Empire, which I'll discuss a little more fully in a moment. With the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989 and the breakup of the Soviet Union just 2 years later, there was a proliferation in the total number of independent countries in that region, in that what had been totally dictatorial region. So from just 9 communist countries, namely the Soviet Union, the 6 Warsaw Pact countries of Central Europe, Yugoslavia, and Albania, from 9 countries, we moved to a total of 29 independent post-communist nations. And of these countries, 2/3 had become either free or partly free by the early 2000s. In other words, in just a decade or so.
Only the Soviets or other ones too?
Sorry?
Only the Soviets when they broke up, or other ones too?
Some of the others. Yugoslavia broke into many pieces as well. Okay, but we'll get to more clarifications in the discussion because there's so much material to cover. So there's a second feature in this graph that is very important. This bumpy green line shows at the top a stagnation. Oop, all right. I'm not. All right, here we go. Back down, back down. Okay. This bumpy green line that I referred to shows that stagnation. You see that the high point was around here, stayed that way from 2004 to 2006 or 7, and then it starts to decline. So after 2007, there was a net decline in the number of fully free countries that I alluded to in the beginning, down from 45% to 42%. This change of direction coincided with Ukraine's Orange Revolution in 2004 and the related authoritarian counteroffensive that ensued. It was driven in large measure by Vladimir Putin's consolidation of dictatorial power in Russia. Remember, he had been elected democratically in in the year 2000 as president, and it took him a couple of terms to consolidate that power. And from there, he made systematic efforts to undermine or reverse democratization in the former Eastern European countries and in the Caucasus and in Central Asia. And other autocrats in the region has followed his example. There were also other, and this was driven from fear that having democracies nearby would undermine the power of these autocrats themselves. But there were also other factors at work in the fledgling democracies of Eastern Europe, negative factors, I would say. They were heavily impacted by the deep recession of 2009 and 10, which was deeper and longer in Europe than it was in the United States. And this was compounded in many cases by weak or corrupt leadership in some of these countries, and the long period it took to catch up economically. This led to democratic disillusionment among large segments of the population of many of these countries. And to this we can add the extraordinary economic rise of China and the aggressive promotion of autocracy around the world that we have seen, particularly in the last 9 years under Xi Jinping. Now let's look at the other two lines on the graph, the straight and rather faint dotted green and blue lines. So I'm talking about this straight line all the way covering the entire period, and I'm talking about this less steep straight line in blue. These trends show that despite the worrisome regression of these past 15 years, if you take the 50-year perspective, a great majority of the gains of the previous 35 years have so far been retained. This next slide gives us a quick look at what happened in the other 58%. 42% democratic, 58% of the world's countries remain, including both the full autocracies and the partly free or hybrid countries. So the orange line shows that the percentage of full-fledged dictatorship has decreased substantially. So there we go. From about 45% in 1972 to 28% now. This is certainly an encouraging development. And the blue line shows that the total number of countries in between the two extremes has continued to hover around 30%. So it's basically bumpy, but not a huge trend line. However, the composition of that group has changed substantially in these 5 decades, and I think it is likely to be the most fluid category going forward as we look to the future of democracy or autocracy. However, there's an important caveat. If we take into account demographics, rather than just the number of countries, the percentage of the world's population living under full authoritarianism is substantially higher than the 28% shown here. This is because of the population of China, with a very huge population of China, which is the preeminent authoritarian country. And even if we look at the 30% of partly free countries demographically, the balance is also somewhat concerning because that group now includes India with 1.4 billion people, virtually the size of China. And here the Modi regime has been systematically for the last few years centralizing power, undercutting freedoms in the country, and going the same route as people like Viktor Orban in Hungary or some of the other autocrats who have pushed the regression that we're talking about. So developments in these two countries could weigh heavily on the future of democracy in the world. Before we discuss what lies behind all the data that the causality that lies behind the data that I've presented, both the positive and the negative or the worrisome aspects, I want to put the current situation of the last 50 years into even a much longer perspective. In my research on democratic transitions, I was deeply impressed by Samuel Huntington's book, 1991 book, The Third Wave, a path-breaking study of democracy's evolution over the past 2 centuries and more, with invaluable insights into the long-term progress and the pitfalls of democratization. Huntington describes several forward waves of democratization, each followed by a reverse wave. He carefully documented a pattern of long periods of liberalization, each followed by shorter periods of partial reversal. In other words, despite the periodic reversals, over time there has been a net positive ratcheting effect, upward ratcheting effect. History, of course, is not like physics. There are no laws that say that past patterns of democratic evolution will hold in the future. Nevertheless, I do feel that Huntington provides a very useful perspective and some reasons for hope. Now let's look very briefly. I said I'm going to try to cover a lot of ground. We'll look briefly at each of these 3 democratization waves and their reversals. The first wave came in the aftermath of the American and French revolutions. And there was a century of gradual democratic consolidation in the United States. Remember, the United States was not a full democracy for the first decades. And France and Germany and other European countries progressed, as well as in Latin America, Argentina and Chile. And the trend was further accelerated by the Versailles Conference treaty after World War I in 1919, which broke up the Habsburg and other empires and under the democratizing vision of our President Woodrow Wilson. So then, just as we saw with the breakup of the Soviet Empire more recently, even back then, there was a proliferation of countries, new countries, many of which gained new freedoms. However, starting in 1922, we see a short reverse wave, driven by the rise of fascism in Germany and Italy, the Great Depression, and the initial subjugation of most of Europe by Hitler and Stalin. Here too we see that history sometimes rhymes. Many of the countries that had been released from the Habsburg and other empires initially became free, but they then reverted for a time to autocracy. Something analogous may be happening now in Hungary, Poland, and certain of the other post-communist countries. The second forward wave that Huntington identifies starts with the Allied victory in World War II, returning democracy to most of Western Europe and triggering the start of decolonization, which included an independent and democratic India. And then soon after, the second reverse wave which began in the 1950s, late 1950s, where Cold War tensions were at their height. Fears of the spread of communism were one of several factors favoring military takeovers in countries like Greece, Brazil, Argentina, and Chile, often with US encouragement or acquiescence. Then Huntington dates his third forward wave from 1974 onward. That's when we negotiated the Helsinki Accords with Moscow, which were an important breakthrough in both American and European support for democratic principles in the world, and especially in Europe. The West traded formal recognition of the existing communist boundaries in Eastern Europe for a Soviet commitment to respect human rights and basic freedoms in their own countries. Even though these commitments were often honored in the breach, Helsinki did lead to a partial liberalization in the Soviet domain and helped to lay the groundwork, in my view, for the post-communist transformations that began 15 years later. And then Mikhail Gorbachev's reforms in the Soviet Union, along with the fall of the Berlin Wall, led to the impressive proliferation of newly free countries that I mentioned earlier. And these transitions, in turn, accounted for over half of the new democracies of Huntington's third wave. Now let's come back to the present. With the democratic stagnation and then the authoritarian resurgence that you see in the graph, we're now clearly well into a third reverse wave. As I mentioned earlier, this regression has been driven in part by an increasingly assertive authoritarian counteroffensive led by Putin and other autocrats, particularly in the former Soviet domain. With Ukraine's Orange Revolution, that counteroffensive took on a new urgency because Putin and others saw the demonstration effect of democracy on their own borders as a direct threat to their continuation and consolidation of power. Okay, long focus on the past, short focus on the present. Let me turn now to the prospects for the future. I will base my brief summary of the lessons learned. I'll base my brief summary of the whole picture in the world based on the lessons learned from the project on democratic transitions, which we mentioned earlier, which, in my opinion, provided a lot of interesting insights. Even though this is the area that I'll focus on, because it's the area that I studied, had direct experience with, and studied most in the project on democratic transitions, the patterns elsewhere show remarkable, very strong similarities. Okay, this slide shows the now I'm looking for slide 6. Okay, so we're in the post-Soviet region now. So this slide shows the current state of democracy in the post-communist region. However, as of 2004, most of the countries that you now see in light green or orange would have appeared in dark green. In other words, just 15 years ago. So Poland, Romania, Bulgaria were all leading democracies, viewed and rated as leading democracies at the time. So were Hungary. And there was, and even these other countries in orange seemed more promising then, including Georgia, than they did now, than they do currently. So they regressed either to the light green, which means semi-consolidated democracies, or to the orange or yellow, which corresponds with the hybrid or authoritarian. Well, I'll just say rather than competitive authoritarian, I'll just use the term hybrid. There are numerous reasons why the post-communist countries, many of them, made little or no progress toward democracy in these years, and why some of them did make strong initial gains, and also why some of those who did make gains regressed. I'll get into that very quickly. However, there are also reasons, the reasons that I'll discuss also give some insight into why some of these countries and others could well bounce back, particularly if the United States, Europe, and other traditional leading democracies can overcome their own current internal political problems with their own democracies, and thus provide more effective example and greater support to democracies elsewhere in the world, the more struggling ones. So this slide summarizes, now I'll move to I have my slides. Oh. Yeah. Some of the factors that I believe, this is in very summary form, I'll comment more specifically, that explain the most successful post-communist transitions and some of the other countries in the third wave of democratization beyond the region are explained by the similar factors. And they're also, my comments will also be pertinent to the reasons for regression, as I've already hinted. The first one is geography. On the western periphery of the Soviet bloc, which you saw, which in 2004 was heavily dark green, in other words, fully democratic, these were the countries that had the most extensive exposure to life on the other side of the Iron Curtain. East Germans saw and coveted the prosperity and freedoms in West Germany. The Czechs, the Poles, the Slovaks, and Hungarians saw the same attractions just across their own borders. And not surprisingly, therefore, these countries were the first to break free from communism, and they became the democratization frontrunners during the 1990s. In other words, they got off to a fast start. For example, Czechoslovakia, and there are other reasons, not just the proximity. Czechoslovakia had experienced full democracy for 20 years after World War I, before Germany took them over and deprived them of freedom, before Hitler did. And some of the other Central European countries had also enjoyed at least partial freedoms in that period. Czechoslovakia, as another example, the example of importance of leadership, had an exceptionally inspiring transitional leader in the person of Václav Havel. And in Poland, Lech Wałęsa was a solid and trusted initial post-communist leader. On the economic and educational levels and the middle class, on all those counts, Hungary, East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and Poland were ahead of most of their neighbors. Again, helping to explain why they were front runners. In Poland, the communist regime had never established as full control of the entire society, the atomization and the destruction of autonomous entities. Thanks in part to the strength of the Catholic Church in Poland during that period, and to the Solidarity labor movement, which, by the way, was helped by the American labor movement. There was enough openness and exchange to permit some insidious assistance on our part. I should also, for those of you who have studied history, Czechoslovakia also had a brief taste of partial freedoms with the Prague Spring in the mid-1960s, which was followed by a Soviet invasion that led to that restored communism in its full power, but also created an underground movement led by others, Václav Havel and others, and that ultimately led to the Velvet Revolution of 1989, which is almost as important as the fall of the Berlin Wall in opening and ending or causing the demise of communism in that region. On the negative side, and the reason you saw on the earlier map that there's so much purple as you go further east, the preconditions for successful transition to democracy were far less favorable in most places. Russia, Ukraine, and Central Asia were far more insulated from the West geographically and economically. With the exception of the Baltics, most of these countries had not enjoyed significant freedoms from before the communist period. Their levels of education and economic development and their middle classes were less developed. In some of these newly independent states, there was also a prior history of violence, intercommunal violence, and more divided societies. And in most of these countries, the old communist leaders and the state industrial bosses, the so-called nomenklatura, simply retained their power under new democratic labels. They pretended to be no longer communist and no longer dictatorial, but in fact, they retained all their power. So these countries did not have genuine revolutions, nor new leadership, therefore, committed to reform. So as we look at the previous maps, it's not surprising that the further east we go, the more purple the map gets. And conversely, there's a lot more green on the borders of the European Union and more orange, as we already discussed, as we go further east. Generalizing on these lessons, and this is worldwide, not just for the region, several things seem very clear to me, and I hope to have some discussion with you about that. First is that democracy cannot be implanted from the outside where favorable conditions, or even encouraged or effectively supported, where favorable conditions do not exist. And certainly it cannot be established by external military force, as we've seen so blatantly of late in Iraq and Afghanistan, for example. Even when internal conditions are relatively favorable, the second point that I want to emphasize is that even when internal conditions are relatively favorable, as we saw in the westernmost countries of the former Soviet bloc, it takes decades to consolidate a new democracy. And even then, and it's a slow process, a slow and uneven process, I should say. It's not linear. For every 2 steps forward, there's often at least 1 step back. Another point I'd emphasize is that individual leaders can make an important difference, both on the positive side, I've mentioned Havel and Wałęsa, but also on the negative side. And there, Putin has been an extremely effective autocrat. And so has Xi Jinping, by the way. Another point that's very important and pertinent to the current situation now: external influences and examples can also have a powerful effect, either on the positive side of the struggle for democracy or on the negative side. So, in closing, let me repeat that in my view, history provides many reasons for hope that democracy can resume its progress over the next decade or two. But we also have to be seriously concerned about the negative trends of these past several years, unless they are countered by the citizenries of the countries involved, the countries concerned, including, very importantly, our own country. For a fourth wave of democratization to take hold in any near future, the United States, Western Europe, and the other advanced democracies will have to get their own houses in order. And they will have to return to providing the kind of principled democratic leadership, however flawed it has been at times, and to the degree of support for democracy elsewhere in the world that proved so successful in the 1990s. But without better examples and stronger leadership coming from these advanced democratic countries, the current wave of democratic regression could ultimately prove long and deep. So let me stop here for now. We've covered a lot of ground, and I promise to leave ample time for discussion. Thank you, and I look forward to your comments and questions.
I'm going to help facilitate the Q&A. So who's got a question? Yeah, right there.
I was going to ask, so what happens,
You've got to speak a little bit louder.
I was going to ask, what actions, have you thought, true democracies like the United States, if any, have really kind of put democracy around the world, in your kind of based on your expertise, and what could have been done differently?
Could you say that just a little bit, elaborate a little bit what you mean?
Would you say, are there actions, and you can share specific ones if you want, that true democracies like the United States have done, that maybe have put democracy around the world, and what could they have done differently if that's the case?
Well, okay, I'll just mention a couple. One on the positive side and one on the negative side. We went all out, starting literally in the year 1990, as soon as the Iron Curtain started falling apart. We provided unequivocal and strong support to democratization in Eastern Europe, including, and very importantly, an invitation to join NATO, because many of these countries wanted freedom, but they were afraid that the Soviet troops that were still stationed in their countries, or that had recently returned back to the Soviet Union, would come back and invade them. So NATO membership, offering the possibility of NATO membership if they democratized, offering economic assistance, offering technical assistance, all sorts of educational exchanges. Universities in the United States, especially those with business schools, for example, helping the new leaders learn how a market economy works, because you can't have a free country if you don't let's say there's a great synergy between a free dispersed economic power as opposed to totally state-controlled economy and the kind of political freedom and diversity that democracy is based on. That's a positive example. In my view, we took our eye off the ball just a few years later, namely 2001, 9/11. We switched our attention entirely to the Middle East. We started pulling out prematurely all these programs of support. So we're talking about only 10 years after the fall of the Berlin Wall. We started cutting back on our support to democracy in this region. We thought we were at least part of the rationale that was given post facto for the invasion of Iraq was to bring democracy to the Middle East. Well, as I said, you don't bring democracy to a region or country by invading and saying, we're going to tell you what to do. If you don't have a real demand for democracy and some of the preconditions that I mentioned, you're going to have not only not succeed in creating a democracy, you're going to create a counter-reaction. And of course, we see an extreme example of that now in Afghanistan after 20 years. So many of the people turned against us because we did a lot of things. We can talk more about Afghanistan later. I want to make sure to try to respond to your question without going into a whole lecture and lots of other examples. And we can come back to that later in discussion. But
Thanks for answering.
Wait. So how concerned should we be around the next election that democracy could slip away here?
the next United States election?
Yes, 2024.
Very concerned. Let me make it very clear.
Well, I'm very worried too.
Sorry?
I'm very worried too. So,
Yeah. But you're asking me how concerned I feel we should be. And I would say very concerned. I say this as an independent. I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican. The Hatch Act for 30 years in government, you're not supposed to take a line with any political party, and I've kept that subsequently. So this is not a partisan political comment. Although some people might take it as such nevertheless. And that is that, you know, the Trump administration, made many of the same moves that the autocrats in Eastern Europe have made to undercut and destroy democracy. Set a terrible example in terms of domestic politics in the United States. And he has such domination over the Republican Party now that there's real fear all over the world that the next president after Biden could be somebody like Trump, either Trump himself or somebody else who is not only not for democracy, not an exemplar of effective democracy, but somebody who is hobnobbing with Putin and other autocrats. He feels more comfortable with them. I'm oversimplifying, but I think it's terribly, terribly important.
Are there safeguards in place for if that were to happen?
No. The only safeguards that are in place are you, the American electorate, and people who are politically active. Because nobody's going to come and rescue the United States from an authoritarian attempted takeover of the sort that some people on January 6th had in mind. The idea, you don't have elections anymore, you just say, I won. And the opposition lost. That's not a genuine election, right? That's not one of the criteria for democracy. So I would be extremely concerned. And one of my reasons for having accepted this meeting is that I think the next generation has to be acutely aware of the really severe dangers to our own democracy. And one point that is clear, hopefully from what I've said so far, is that democracy in one place has an effect on the fate of democracy in one country has impact on people in other countries. It's a demonstration effect. a copycat effect to some extent.
Yeah.
So-
Sort of like the domino theory.
Well, domino theory, there's something to it, but it sounds too automated. There's a human factor, and there's so many factors. There's individual leadership, there, all the other factors that I mentioned. I don't think there's a simple domino possibility, but there certainly are dangers of slippery slopes, etc.
Another question. Dan?
So thank you for your talk. I can stand
Again,
up.
I'll ask you to talk louder.
Yeah, I'll come closer. How about that? I wanted to pick up on this theme as well in sort of the American context. I don't mean to be sort of myopic about that. And it goes pre-Trump, pre-contemporary populism and things like that. But, in your definitions of democracy, you talk about political office open to most adult citizens.
Right.
I think you said realistically open to most adult citizens.
Right.
In contrast to being foreclosed because of opposition to the regime. I'm wondering though about whether so-called advanced democracies like the US and probably the US more than anywhere else qualify as that, or if money has become too much an obstacle. Not opposition to a regime, but without access to capital, to money, you fall into what Sheldon Mulling calls, managed democracy, or others have formulated under audience democracy, or things like this. Is that still a full democratic system?
No.
Where virtually nobody
No.
in the US can run for national office?
I think that's an extremely good question. I should modify, don't run away. Just kidding. So that's an extremely good question. A truly free election is one in which each vote counts. Each individual has equal power. In our system, and unfortunately in all too many other systems, money has such power that there's no equality. The amount of money that a billionaire can put into a campaign, or certain large corporations and lobbyists, employing lobbyists can put into a campaign, or money in the money in politics is a very corrosive factor. There have been attempts, and John McCain, a Republican, was one of the leaders of the attempt to improve campaign finance, to reform campaign finance. Our democracy is limping badly because of that. It's also limping badly, in my view, because of the primary system, where the most extreme portion of the left and the right, in each Democrats and Republicans respectively, they're the ones who come out in the primaries. They're the ones who tend to nominate the majority of candidates, which encourages polarization, and that in turn leads to gridlock in Washington. Gridlock leads to democratic disillusionment. We saw that very badly in Eastern Europe after about 10 to 15 years of post-communist efforts, partly because the environment was unfavorable economically, but for other reasons as well. So we have so much to do in perfecting our own democracy. We have to work at it. If the United States fails as a democracy, then my hopes for the future are, at least for the near-term future, and the lifetimes of those who are professors as opposed to students here tonight, then it would be very dire. I'm very hopeful that the American people have begun to realize some of the dangers of their own democracy and will want to reclaim that democracy. We can come back more to that as well. I'm not in any hurry, but I want to make sure that Lynn is. I want to make sure everybody who has questions gets a turn.
Thank you. In the short time that we've had widespread social media use, we've seen like the Arab Spring come about. We've also seen like populism in the United States, where Donald Trump was on Twitter tweeting out these tweets. So I wonder, do you in general see social media as changing the game to the transition to democracies worldwide in a positive or negative way?
Yes. Well, it's a tremendously important factor, both on the positive and the negative side. At the beginning, as you will remember, it was seen as very positive. The Arab Spring was initially in part ignited, or at least facilitated, by social media. That's what brought out the crowds into Tahrir Square in Cairo, etc. So that was positive. Since then, things have changed. Autocrats have learned to use or block, either block or use to their own purposes, social media. And autocrats have also, and others, non-democrats in the United States and in Europe and other places, have also learned to use disinformation to pursue their own agendas and to undercut those who oppose or those who they disagree with. These are both negative for democracy. Now, if I had been asked in 2011, at the time of the Prague Spring, are social media a positive thing for democracy, I would have said yes. Now you ask me, in the short term, I'd say no, but the longer term, we don't know. I don't know. Maybe social media experts among the faculty or among the students have a better answer. And by the way, I said I'd be open not only to questions and answers, but comments. I'd appreciate any insights that any of you want to share on that. But I think it's very much a mixed factor, and it's not the total answer is not in. And then the kinds of problems that Facebook is now being faced with, or admitting to, or not admitting to, or trying not to admit to, is just part of the equation. How that will be resolved by our Congress, by executive action, for example, we don't know yet. But I think it's a big potential danger. Ultimately, it's a big asset if somehow we could use that. Social media could be used as a more effective educational tool, because as we discussed earlier, the American public needs to become more aware of these dangers and needs to become more proactive in turning out for elections and choosing candidates that really believe in democracy rather than just enriching themselves or pursuing a very narrow ideological agenda and forgetting about the basic premise of democracy, that all people and all points of view should be taken seriously and given equal weight.
I think we forget that Facebook reaches over 1 billion people, right? Worldwide, it's not just an American thing.
Several billion, as I thought.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You had your hand up for a while. You.
Oh, I'm just doing this.
Oh, okay.
Well, I had a question I wanted to ask.
Sure.
Okay, I'll ask you to speak louder.
Yes, sir.
You don't have a microphone.
I had the opportunity before I went to college to go to France, and while I was there, in some of my classes, there's some fellow students from Iran, and I always think of my friends like Armin, Mohammed, and Efron, because they were about my age and stuff. And one of the reasons they left their country was they were going to have to fight in the military, or rather serve in the military for potential conflicts with us when we had them the last 2 years with Iran. So my kind of question is, like, we have all these like not democracies. We have like these more authoritarian countries and stuff, and I don't really see any hope for like North Korea, say, but like what about more like the fringe countries in the middle? What kind of things can the citizens do to kind of like get I don't want to say recognition, but like obviously we have the social media to help in like the Prague situation to see what the problems are with the governments. Like in Iran, it kills like 1,800 people a week sometimes when they have big protests. But what can we do, and like what can other people in the world do to help like bring democracy and peace and maybe like a new government
To a country like Iran, you're saying?
Yeah, I mean obviously it would take a lot. Like I don't really see there being like a new government happening anytime soon, but like maybe the near term future. What could be done to do that?
Yeah. Well, basically my answer is all of the things that I referred to earlier and that we did well in the 1990s and into the early 2000s in Eastern Europe are the kinds of things we should do. That does not include invasion of Iran. But we do have to at the same time protect our own strategic interests. In other words, given Hezbollah and the Revolutionary Guards and the types of actions that affiliated organizations like Hezbollah and others represent not only the threat to us but to our allies and to democracy more generally, we have to play both sides. We have to be concerned with both sides of the equation. So we have to be very, very careful about dealing with the current regime in Iran, on the one hand, for security, these kind of security reasons. On the other hand, we cannot be too heavy-handed, and we do have to lead by example. And so I think that my whole presentation, in effect, is an attempt to deal with your question about how we would deal with, we should ideally deal with a country like Iraq, like Iran, or for Iraq for that matter.
Other questions? Any women in the audience have a question?
Claire. Hi, Ambassador Basora. Thanks so much for this talk. Can you hear me? Okay, I wanted to get back to the Huntington thesis that you brought up and
Yes.
these waves of progress.
I have to
and
get a little
regress.
closer because at my age, voice doesn't travel quite as, or ears don't penetrate.
Well, it's the mask. Normally I'm
I
quite
know.
loud. Yeah, the Huntington thesis you discussed about waves of progress of freedom and
Yeah.
then regress afterwards. I'm wondering if he talked about, or if you see, what was the causality that drove either the waves of progress or the waves of regress, and what made it change? Like, what was the inflection point that made it start moving forward again? And do you see that happening in any way
Yeah.
with this idea of a fourth wave?
Well, that's a very good and challenging question because
I teach for a living.
I know, and so asking hard questions is essential to the teaching process. So I have alluded to some of them. Wars can sometimes make a difference because they break up the old order and they permit people's demands to come to the surface. I'm oversimplifying, but that's part of it. Individuals, Woodrow Wilson, made a difference. He believed in democracy. The United States had rescued Europe from that war, World War I. So he said, okay, we want to end some of these authoritarian empires and let people express themselves freely, a very major step towards democracy. So that's part of it. Economic catastrophe on the negative side, the Great Depression. I alluded, but also in the Great Recession of the 2008, 9, 10, which hit Europe very, very heavily. It was a major factor, not in Europe more generally, in how should I say, encouraging some of the less democratically oriented minority parties in Western Europe, but more importantly, in Eastern Europe, these countries had a long struggle to make their economies viable. It took, some of them lost 20, 30, and even 40% of their GDP for the first few years because their industries were not competitive under communism. So they had just begun to catch up and progress economically in the early, so just before 2008, let's say by 2006, 7, they were catching up. And then this heavy recession hits them. So economic damage of that magnitude can help set off a negative trend. But I come back to the idea that individuals and events in major countries, so an individual like Donald Trump in this major country made a big difference. He's had a lot of imitators in other countries. Putin has been very successful, a real role model for autocrats and how to very systematically destroy the opposition. Xi Jinping is another example. So history, you're a teacher, you know that history is complex. I can't give you a single factor, but I've given you a few of the main factors that have affected the periods that I've studied with really great impact.
Sure, so anything could come next.
So I will try to make my way back down here.
Yeah, up there.
You mentioned earlier,
Again, I'll ask you to talk a little louder
yes,
through the
you
mask.
mentioned
I'll get
earlier,
closer.
you mentioned earlier the primary system in this country, feeding polarization and gridlock and ultimately perhaps disillusionment with democracy. I just thought it was interesting that you mentioned that because as I understand it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, but as I understand it, our current primary system evolved out of an attempt to make the nominating process more democratic.
More democratic?
Yeah.
As opposed to the backroom political machinery, you know, the smoky room, back room kind of.
Exactly.
That was the idea, yes. But the question is how it works in practice. And in practice, the way it's working is that only a few people turn out for the primaries, and those few people are to some extent influenced, or at least the candidates of the extremes of the left or the right are heavily subsidized by the big amount of campaign finance money. This distorts democracy. Does that address your question properly, or?
No. Mostly, I wondered what kind of a solution you could imagine to exactly that kind of problem that you say, that only a handful of partisans show up.
Well, I mean, the first past the post system that they're using in Maine, and now some other states are starting to introduce, is a partial solution to that problem. Because you can have somebody who's not on the far right of the Republican Party or on the far left of the Democratic Party, a moderate of either party, succeed in becoming the candidate without this hyperpartisanism as a label or attached as a millstone around it, if you follow me. Okay, I better get back down and.
So I think I just really want to question one of the essential assumptions of this talk, which is
over there. Sorry.
Which is, essentially, we're not quite talking about democracy through this. We're talking about capitalist democracy. So I really want to question one of the key things you mentioned earlier, how you thought a free market was kind of essential with democracy.
Yes.
That just kind of seems strange to me, since businesses are one of the most autocratic parts of our nation. According to your definition here, there's no election. It's not like somebody, worker really has much say in who's their boss, who's their manager, who owns the place of work. There's not much opportunity for any regime opponents to get into a position of power within a company. And freedom of speech, press, and association are heavily cracked down upon, especially seen in the decline of the union. So, especially we've seen now, as we talked about earlier with Donald Trump, one of his key lines was that he's going to run the nation like he ran his business. And there's some argument of people saying that he was just a bad businessman. There's also, if you look at his tendencies, his assumptions of how power worked, he did indeed run this nation, like he ran his business. So I think that's kind of, my question is how you can consider capitalist democracy kind of be the gold standard when, in fact, free market is inherently autocratic and has led to kind of disastrous results when it mixes with
Okay, I get your point. And part of the answer is the quote from Winston Churchill, which many of you may have heard or familiar with, that democracy is the worst of all political systems, except all the others that have been tried from time to time. I would apply that to your question about the market economy, or the importance of a market economy. The idea of having all power over the economy concentrated in the state rather than spread out through the entire citizenry doesn't work. If you have enormous economic power, you're going to dominate the political system. You're going to have an autocracy.
I'm not talking about the central government having all control, though.
Well, wait a minute.
I'm talking about individual businesses being run by people who make up a large percentage of
if you're talking about creating a kind of corporate democracy where all shareholders actually vote and you don't have an inner circle board of directors.
I'm not necessarily talking about any one system. I'm more talking about how the current system, the one that has kind of become hegemonic within the world through the oppression of other systems, has inherently autocratic elements driven throughout everyone's life.
I agree with you that large concentrations of corporate power go against democracy.
but you also think that's inherent to what a good democracy is.
So I think what?
You mentioned earlier on that you thought part and parcel to a good democracy is a free market. But, all the problems that you're
A free market, but the kind of corporate, intense, concentrated corporate power that you're talking about is not a fully free market.
Well, then,
If you
can
have a
understand how that's
monopolistic market,
a complete paradox where you want a free market, but then a free market is inherently autocratic, and that is the largest
No, it
percentage of
isn't.
a person's life.
a
So you disagree.
monopolistic market, a free market that becomes monopolistic is no longer free. In other words, you have to reform the market, the extremes of power concentrated in large corporations. Citizens United was a step exactly in the wrong direction. So the point is that the only way of not having some corporations have some power would be to in effect, repeal Citizens United and have much more effective antitrust regulation, which we have had at times in the United States.
But I would still leave at the end of the day, if somebody goes to their job where that has the greatest impact on their life, they won't have a say in anything that happens in that business.
Well, you're talking about democracy within the employment world and the corporate world. I'm talking about the governance of the country as a whole. Obviously, there'd be a lot to be said for the kind of reforms that would give you a much more democratic model for the way corporations are run. That's a whole other subject. But I stand by my conviction that you cannot have a democracy without wide dispersion of ownership of the means of production. That's what I mean by a market economy, a true open market economy. Okay, we don't want to.
One more question. Yeah. Yeah.
So I was wondering, how does
Okay, can you speak a little louder?
yeah, so why do people turn to these, I guess, authoritarian fascist ideologies? Why are people, what's going through the minds?
Why are they?
What's going through the minds of the people who turn to these ideologies? How does this happen to some
Through the minds of
people, not others?
the people who try to become dictators, or what?
Or the followers.
Or their
People
followers.
The people who enable us to actually want it in society, or yeah, basically.
Well, so for the let me get back here so others can hear me. For a man like Putin, the motivation is very clear: personal aggrandizement, personal power, even security. Now he fears for his future because he's made so many enemies. So maintaining power becomes more and more important. Just ambition. I mean, the inherent in human nature that many people have great ambition and they don't care about others. So that explains the mentality of the would-be autocrat. Now you ask about the followers. Well, followers follow for a variety of reasons. Some because of the charisma of the leader. Others because of total ignorance. Lack of civic education is a very major factor. That's why I talked about education and the well-developed middle class as being one of the preconditions for effective democracy. So now we talked about social media. Part of the way that autocrats, potential dictators, appeal to the people is that they make promises or they create false visions of reality, and they are convincing. They manage to convince. They also have supporters who, in effect, multiply or underline or try to validate the false information and the false claims on which on the false promises that they give you. So civic education. That's why a college like this is a place where I hope that all of you, as students and professors, will see it as your responsibility to help people become more educated about these issues and why autocracy, despite the fact that there are problems in the corporate dominance, nevertheless, autocracy is not the solution. It's a false promise.
I'm sure Ambassador Basora will answer questions.
I'll be happy to talk individually for a little while.
We're going to let everybody go. And thank you.
Thank you all, and your questions and comments were far beyond my expectations. Thank you for your feedback and your ideas, and for listening.